Thanks. You can have a seat. This morning, we are going to begin a new series walking through the life of Joseph. Joseph happens to be one of my favorite Old Testament Bible characters. He's one of the few Bible characters in which there's really nothing critical or negative said about, which makes him very, very unique. In the book of Genesis, he's actually the last one of 7 heroes of the faith that is focused on in the book of Genesis. We're going to spend a lot of time this morning actually looking at his family, because I think in order to understand Joseph, you need to understand the environment and the world in which he was raised. So we're going to spend some time. You're just going to have to bear with me for a while, and I'm going to give you a kind of a Reader's Digest version through his family. And so I'm going to jump back and forth to this slide right here. This is the genealogy of Abraham. And so this will help you understand. Joseph actually comes into that little middle section. But we want to start up at the top with his great-grandfather, who was Abraham. And if you'll remember the story as far as Abraham goes, Abraham basically had 3 wives. He had Hagar, who had Ishmael. He had Keturah, who had 6 sons. And then he had the one that we know about, that we focus on, Sarah. Abraham and Sarah. And you'll remember, she had a child late in life, 90 years old. That's late. She had this child, and his name was Isaac. And if you'll remember in the story of Abraham and Isaac, he's the one that Abraham takes up to the mountain to sacrifice to God. And God spares his son and then provides a ram for him, and they make that offering, and then they come down. And a little bit later, Abraham sends his servant to go find Isaac a wife. So I'm going to go back. I got to remember which way we went. Yeah, back to this story. So now we've gone from Abraham to Sarah. Now we're at Sarah, we're at Isaac. And in the story of Isaac, this would be Joseph's grandfather. So in the story of Isaac, here's what happens. He marries a girl by the name of Rebekah. And if you'll remember the story of Rebekah, she ends up having twins. And that was a little story where the hand came out and they tied a little string around it to figure out which one was first. And so she has 2 sons by the name of Jacob and Esau. And if you'll remember, and this becomes important to our story, she shows favoritism to Jacob. And ultimately, what happens is, if you'll remember the story, Jacob and Esau have this soup thing going on, and he sells his birthright. Esau, who doesn't value his birthright, was the firstborn, gives away his birthright to Jacob. And so when it comes to the point that Isaac is about ready to die, and he has to give a blessing to the children, if you remember the story, Rebekah comes to Jacob and says, "Hey, let's trick your dad. I will make a meal like your brother would make. We're going to kill a goat, and we're going to put the goat skin on you because he's a hairy guy and you're a no-hairy guy, so we need to make you hairy. So your dad can't see, so we're going to trick him, and he's going to feel your skin, and he's going to think it's Esau, and he'll give you the blessing." Remember the story? Because this is an important story in the life of Joseph. I don't have time to go into this, but if you want a fascinating study, study the clothing and the life of these people. Because in that story, she deceives him with a piece of animal skin. You're going to see in this story of Joseph, how do Joseph's brothers deceive Jacob? They take his coat and they put blood on it to deceive his dad. And then you're going to see again in the life of Joseph when he's with Potiphar's wife and she grabs his coat. And then you're going to see with him as a king, basically, with this unique coat. It's interesting to this whole fascinating thing. We're going to look at the coat this morning that Joseph is given. So you have that story, but as a result of that story, what happens is, it's interesting, Rebekah, who loved Jacob, Esau, who's mad now, looks at Jacob and says, the next time I see you, you're a dead man. So Rebekah comes down to her son, whom she loves, and says, you got to get out of here. So Jacob has to take off, and Jacob and Rebekah now, Jacob and Esau, the whole family's a mess at this point. So now we come to the story of Jacob, who's basically Joseph's father. So as you look at it, you now have the story of Jacob. And you see there all of the sons of Jacob. They're all listed in there. But if you'll notice, there's one father, Jacob. There's 4 women involved in either concubines or stepting or whatever else, because you have to remember the story of Jacob. So in the story of Jacob, you remember what happens. He basically finds this guy who's got this daughter named Rachel. And he is head over heels in love with Rachel. He thinks she's the most awesome thing in all of the world. So he makes a deal and says, I want your daughter Rachel. And he says, okay, but for 7 years you got to work for me. So he works for him, and it's one of those fascinating stories. Just time flew by because he was in love. So he gets married. And in that day, the way the marriage thing worked, then when they go into the bride chambers and he pulls back the veil, it's not Rachel. He's been deceived. It's Leah, the older sister. And of course, he's a little upset. He's worked 7 years for this moment. So he goes back to him and he says, what did you do to me? He goes, well, she's the oldest, and I couldn't marry off the youngest until the oldest was married off. But if you'll work another 7 years, I'll give you that one too. So he does. And the time flies by. And he marries now Rachel. So now he's got Rachel and Leah. And of course, in that culture, then you watch what happens. He then starts to deceive. Jacob starts to deceive their dad. Starts doing this whole thing with the sheep. And he ends up with a huge flock. And he basically comes to his dad, and he basically comes to their dad and says, hey, look, there's no reason for me to be taking care of your stuff. I got plenty of my stuff. Let me just go away, and we'll go do our own thing. So he goes away. Now, he's got to raise all these animals, so what has to happen now is he needs kids. And in that culture, let me tell you something, boys were everything. In fact, they don't really even count the girls. I'm not saying that's the way it should be. That's the way it was. And so in this story, what happens is when it's all said and done, Rachel and Leah get into this competition. Who can provide the most kids? Ultimately, Leah wins, gives him 6 children. If that wasn't enough, they then get into this battle using their servants and saying, hey, look, why don't you go try to have a kid with my servant? And so Leah lets him have her servant. She gives him 2 kids. Rachel, who still has not been able to have a child yet, says, well, take my servant, and her servant now gives him 2 kids. So now we're at the point where there are 10 children, and yet his favorite wife, Rachel, has given him no children. And so she begs God and pleads with God, and finally God gives her a child. That child's name is Joseph. She continues to pray, and Joseph goes through there's a whole bunch of things that happen within the family, but then Rachel has another child. So Joseph has a little brother called Benjamin. The problem is that when Benjamin was born, Rachel didn't survive childbirth, and she dies. So you have Jacob now with this heartbreak of having lost his favorite wife in childbirth at this point. What you need to remember is that as we head into the story where we're going to read this morning, a couple of things. This issue of deceit, of deceiving, has played a big role in the life of Joseph and his family to this point. We're on back to Jacob and Esau, and with Rachel and Leah's father deceiving him and him deceiving them. So this idea of deceit has just kind of played all the way along in his life at this point. In this story, as we look at it this morning, we're going to pick up the story with Joseph at 17 years old. Now, the life of Joseph basically divides itself pretty nicely into three sections. There's his growing up years, which we're going to talk about this morning. Then there's 17 to about 30, that 13 years in there. That's when he's in prison and difficulty and all kinds of things. And then after 30, he's actually going to become the second most powerful person in all of the world. The known world at that time is the right hand of Pharaoh. So you're going to watch, as we walk through this journey, him take this path. But what I want you to understand before we get into the text this morning is this. I want you to understand that at 17 years old, here's what he's seen. He's watched as Jacob, his daddy, and his uncle Esau met for the first time. And in that story, what happens is Jacob takes all of his armies and all of his stuff because he's going to meet Esau. And the last time he saw Esau, Esau said, "I'm going to take you out." And unfortunately, he's somewhat of a coward because he puts everybody in front, including his wives and his kids, because he feels like if my brother's going to take him out, he's going to take out 400 people before he gets to me. And so Joseph has watched this story unfold. Joseph watched as his daddy, Jacob, started limping. Hey, Daddy, why are you hobbling around all the time now? And Jacob explains to him that he had wrestled with God, and God had changed his name from Jacob to Israel. So in the Bible, when you read Jacob or Israel, you need to understand they're the same person, okay, as we play it out. But he had watched that. He had listened to his dad tell that story. He had watched his family as his sister, one of his stepsisters, was raped at Shechem. And he watched his dad didn't do anything about it. But his brothers were so upset, his brothers went to Shechem and basically wiped out all of the men. Then they took everything from Shechem that they could take, including the women, and brought them back home. And when Jacob finds out about all of this, it's interesting. He doesn't say anything about his daughter. He doesn't say anything about what his sons have done in murdering an entire city. All Jacob is concerned about is, what are people going to think about me? And Joseph has watched this. Joseph has watched as Reuben, the oldest son, took one of his dad's concubines, and Dad acted like nothing happened. He had watched that. He had been brought up in a home that was incredibly dysfunctional. He had watched as Deborah, the nurse, had died. He had watched as his mom had died. He had watched his grandfather, Isaac, die. And he's only 17. He's from one messed up family. I mean, you need to understand this. You need to understand that as we look into Joseph's life, there's not a lot of things to go, yay! And we pick up our story in Genesis, and if you want to follow this series, Genesis 37 through 50 is where we're going to be. So here's what it says. We're not reading that many chapters. We're just going to go 4 verses this morning, so relax. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. And we don't know how many brothers were here, but it points out these are the stepbrothers from the servants. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, that's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. Sometimes this is called a coat of many colors. Sometimes it's called a varied colored garment. And he made an ornate robe for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him. And they could not speak a kind word to him. Now this is important as we're going to get into the life of Joseph. This is the only verses we're going to look at this morning. But let's make sure we understand the story. His brothers, at least the four with that stepbrothers that were servants, not really, again, we may have had others, but the Bible points out these four, are tending flocks, and Joseph comes up on the scene. Daddy's favorite. And Daddy's favorite goes back and says, hey, Daddy, let me tell you what the boys are doing up there. And it's basically, we don't know what they were doing. But basically, he says, look, here's what's happening, and you ought to know about it. Now, his dad, Jacob, at this point has a choice in how he handles the situation. But he listens to him. And his solution to this issue is to make him a coat. And we don't know. There's a lot of ideas here about what this thing is. There are some people that teach that it was the outside garment, the coat that you would wear. In this culture, basically, there were two main garments. There was what we would call the inner garment, which was basically, think of it as, I guess the way for us to think about it is running shorts and a t-shirt, something you can move quick in, something that when it gets hot you can basically still have clothing on but be as free as you can be. And then there was an outer garment, which I think of it like a sweatsuit kind of thing, that you would wear that would kind of give you a little more insulation. So we don't know if it was the outside coat that you would wear, or a lot of people believe it was actually the inner garment that you would wear. And in this culture, usually, because you were working all the time, it was short. So what you would do is when it got hot, when you were working and stuff like that, you could take it and tuck it into your belt so you could run and chase sheep or do chores or do whatever it is you had to do. But what is unique about this garment that he makes for his son is it's flashy. It's special. It brings attention to itself. So the issue is, why would you do that? A lot of people believe it was the longer undergarment, which would actually go to the ankles, which would be something that would be worn by a king or something that would be worn by somebody of high estate. So a lot of people believe that Jacob's response to him telling about his brothers is he gives him this coat, which basically is saying this: you're my favorite, you're special, you don't need to work like your brothers have to work. You're the next heir. You're the firstborn of Rachel, who was my favorite, so you're the one who I'm giving everything to as a firstborn. He was making a statement in giving him this garment. And in giving him this garment, what's ironic is he was doing the very thing that his mother did with him, and it cost them their relationship. And this is going to cost him his relationship with Joseph, because when it's said and done, it's going to be that coat that is a symbol for the brothers of their hatred and animosity for him. So Joseph, for whatever reason, now has this garment that his daddy has given him, and basically is saying, I'm better than you. So when the brothers learn of this, the text says they hate him. They don't just hate him, they hate him to the point that they cannot even speak his name and say one nice thing. This is a whole new level of hatred. This isn't just, we don't like you. This is there is nothing good about you. Nothing. Now, I think that's important for us to understand. Because as we look at this guy Joseph, there's a lot of lessons in you looking at his background that help us as we go forward. So let's talk about some practical things that will help us this week. Because he was so hated, he's isolated within his own family. It's as lonely as they come. He's got 11 brothers. Benjamin's probably too young to even be a part of any of this. But so he's got 10 brothers that want nothing to do with him. You can guarantee that their mothers feel the same way. And so they want to take shots at him when they can. There's only one person that's cheering him on in his corner, and that's Daddy. And that ain't helping. So Joseph is surrounded by this idea of, even though there are people around me, I'm as lonely as they can be. There's a question for you. Is that the way a 17-year-old should feel? I mean, where's God? Why isn't God, apparently he's a good kid. He's trying to do what's right. Why is he struggling? Why aren't things going well for him? And here's what you're going to find. In the next 13 years of his life, the more he tries to do the right, the worse things get. And what you're going to find is you find Joseph in this world of loneliness, of persecution, of difficulty and hardship. And he's only 17. See, what we forget is that God has a bigger picture. You see, God knows that in God's plan, this guy is going to be the second most powerful person in all of the world. So I have to get him ready for that. So I'm going to have to allow some difficulty and hardship. He's going to understand what it is to lose people you love. He's going to understand what it is to have to deal and see with this dysfunction within his family. He's going to go through some really hard times. So at 17, I got to start getting him ready. Kids, listen to me. So much of what you're dealing with right now is at the front end of preparing you for the back end of life. And a lot of times kids look at it and go, well, I want this, and I want this, and I want this, and I want this, and I want it to be easy, and it's hard, and it's difficult, and I'm going to go make that. Well, stop for a minute. What's happening right now in your world is preparing you for the world to come, for the world that you're going to live in as an adult. And God is molding and shaping you and using even bad situations to prepare you for what's down the road. Be ready for that. Don't look at it and go, well, it's just God doesn't care. No, it's just the opposite. And I'll never forget when my dad came home, my senior year in high school. I was getting ready. I'd come to the end of my junior year. I was getting ready to start my senior year in high school. And my dad came home and said, Texaco's transferring us. We're going to Chicago. We were living in Detroit at the time. And I'll never forget the struggle for me as a kid trying to figure that out. God, why are you doing this to me? I'm in a Christian school. I'm doing all these great things and everything. Why in the world, God, are you just uprooting me my senior year in high school? And let me tell you something. We tried all kinds of things. I had a friend of mine, a good Christian friend, his good Christian, solid Christian parents. I was going to live with them my senior year. My parents were going to be in Chicago, and I was going to stay in Detroit. And I presented it to my parents. They said, let us think about it. And later, I'll never forget, my dad sat us down at the table and he says, listen, he said, here's the thing. He said, we've always believed that God's led us where God wants to lead us. And as a family, this is what God is doing. And as a family, we're going as a family. That was hard. But I look back now, I can see the hand of God all over that. Really hard to see when you're 17 years old. And whatever you're going through, whatever you're struggling with right now, here's what I would say. You may not understand it, but there's a bigger picture at play here. You're just going to have to trust God, like Joseph does in this story. The second idea here that you see from the life of Jacob, in that Jacob hurts Joseph by playing this favoritism thing. He should have figured it out. But one of the dangers that you see is what he did was he gave Joseph a leadership position before Joseph was able to have and prove the responsibility that he could even handle it. He basically said, I'm going to give you all of this now. And I'm going to let your brothers know about it too. And the problem was, it may have been the right thing, but it was not the right time, and it was definitely not the right way to do it. And one of the things that I think you start to see in this is by Dad playing the favorite route, which Dad learned honestly from his mother. He had watched his mom do this. Now he's doing it with his kids. And by the way, when Joseph ends up leaving, he ends up putting Benjamin in that place. He still doesn't learn it even after that. We see that at the end of the story. But one of the things that you see in this story is this idea that, look, he played favorites. He started saying, look, I'm going to give you this before you're really ready for this. You know how often I see that happening today in our culture? I want to give my kids what I didn't have. Maybe one of the worst things you're doing for them. You got where you are because you learned some skills along the road of hard. I mean, you think about it for a minute. I know 16-year-olds that get new cars. So here's the question. If you get a new car at 16, what do you ever have to look forward to? We give $500-$600 cell phones to second graders. They can't remember their backpack. And we hand them a $600. How long did it take you to get something worth $600? And we're throwing at these kids things that they don't have the responsibility for. We failed to teach them that with responsibility comes reward. We just jump right to reward. I mean, I remember, and again, it's the whole responsibility thing. I mean, I remember my first car. Remember your first car? Getting ready to leave college. I just graduated. I didn't have a vehicle. I needed a vehicle. Heard a guy down the hall was taking his car to the junkyard. I called the junkyard, and I said, if I can drive a car in there, how much will you give me? He said, $50. I went down the hall, and I said, hey, look, I know you're going to take it to the junkyard, and they're going to give you $50. I'll give you $50 right now and save you the trip. He said, great. Gave him $50, I owned a car. 1976 Nova. 2 problems. Number one, came out of Michigan. So if you know anything about Michigan, they don't plow roads, they salt them. This thing, you could see the cement. You could see the road. A piece of plywood will fix that. It was so rusted out and so covered with rust, I went to Sears. I bought a whole bunch of cans of spray paint, spray painted it all, so at least it all looked the same color. Bought it for $50. We called it a Johnny Cash car. That's what the CBers called it when they saw it going down the road. It had been T-boned. And so the frame was out of alignment. So you know how when you drive down a road and it's just snowed and you have the 2 tire tracks that run down the road? This had 4. I'm not kidding. It drove down the road like this because it had been T-boned in an accident. The frame was all out of line. Now you laugh, but I drove that thing for a year, had my father-in-law sell it for me. We got $150 for it after I'd driven it for a year. I also remember working up to the point that my wife and I got to buy our first new car. There's something to look forward to. And I think we've forgotten this. And it's like, again, we forgot, Jimmy, we told Jimmy, we said, look, you want a car, you're going to have to go get a car. And so fortunately, we were able to, somebody gave him one, and we needed to restore it. So Bob and Lauren gave him this 76 El Camino, and I told him, I said, I'll help you with everything, restore it, but it's yours. You got to pay all the bills. So we restored this thing. And never forget, he didn't know we were there, but he was leaving Doug and Terry's, and Doug and I were out on the front porch, and he didn't know it. He didn't see us. He got out in the front thing, and he laid a patch. He hit that gas, and I mean, he laid tire marks for a good 3-4 houses. And I'll never forget, Doug looked at me, and he said, so what are you going to do about that? I said, nothing. He said, what do you mean, nothing? I said, he has to buy the tires. I said, the first time he buys a set of tires, he ain't going to be doing that all the time. You know what happened when he came home? Dad, do you know how expensive tires are? Yep. Think he did it again? No. Why? Because he started realizing there's a price tag paid with it. I'm sure he did it other times, but he wasn't doing it like he was before. Why? This idea. And so what happens is Jacob here, by giving him this coat before he was ready to handle the responsibilities that came with that, hurt him. In fact, what's ironic here is by giving him that, it ultimately cost him his relationship with Joseph, because it built so much animosity with his brothers that they sell him into slavery. And Jacob, who now takes his favored son, who he never gets to see again. Why? Because that price of that favoritism thing cost him. And I would just challenge you to be very, very careful here. Those of you who are parents, those of you who are grandparents, you be really careful with looking at how you view and how you honor and how you treat kids, grandkids. The last lesson is this. When you look at the family history, there is a generational thing that happens in this genealogy, going back to Abraham, where you see the generation after generation repeating the same mistakes. Where all of a sudden, instead of nobody has the courage to stand up and go, we need to change this in our family history. We need to change this family dynamic. And so you can go all the way back in the genealogy and you watch this issue of deceit being repeated and repeated and repeated. It's not because, my parents did. It's because nobody stood up and became the hero and said, you know what? I'm going to change it for this family. I'm going to break the cycle. I'm going to break the chain. And you watch this family. The thing that's great about Joseph is, Joseph actually does that. He actually breaks this cycle of jealousy and animosity and hatred and anger. He breaks the cycle. Some argue actually that Joseph at the end may even revert back a little bit to this whole idea of deceit in the way that he handles Jacob and getting back and forth to Egypt. I don't think that's what the issue was, but some people even go, there's even a hint of it there because it starts to want to creep back into the family. And I just want to challenge you, when I do marriage counseling with couples that I'm going to marry, one of the things that we do is we look at what's called family of origin. And I say, tell me some great things that your parents did growing up. And they'll rattle off this and they'll rattle off that and this and I say, okay, so tell me some things that you saw that you really don't want to bring into your marriage. Because your parents weren't perfect. My parents weren't perfect. I'm not perfect. My kids have things that Gina and I did that they don't want to bring into their marriage. I'm honest enough to be able to say that. And one of the things that I explained to them is unless you break the cycle and unless you can identify it and come up with a plan, you're going to repeat it. It's the reason children of alcoholics become alcoholics. Because they grow up saying, I'm never going to do that, I'm never going to do that, I'm never going to do that. And they get into a crisis situation where they don't know how to respond, and they don't have a plan. And the next thing you know, you find them going down the same path that their parents went down. Why? Because they never came up with a plan to say, we're going to change it. This is going to be different. And I just want to challenge you to be honest enough with yourself to realize that, you know what? Don't blame your parents for it. Don't blame your parents' past for the choices you're making in the present. If there are things in your family that you're doing and that your parents did that aren't healthy, then you be the hero to step up to the plate and say, I'm going to break the cycle. It's not going to be true of us. You know, I love my family and everything else. My dad was a workaholic. He will tell you that. If he was here today, he would tell you that. And he went to his grave regretting the fact that he spent so much time at work and not enough time with his family. You want to know what pattern I fell into? Want to know what my greatest struggle is? What are my great struggles? Why? Because it's something I have to fight. It's something that I have to really work hard at. Trying not to go down that road. And sometimes I do well, and sometimes I don't. But I'm trying to, as best as possible, break the cycle, trying to help my boys break the cycle. Why? Because it's easy to go down those same paths if you don't come up with a plan, you don't figure out a way to change it. And I just want to challenge you, because one of the things that you learn in Joseph is this whole issue of, look, be careful. Be careful of the favoritism thing. Be careful of the idea here that you're just going to keep repeating what you saw your parents do, even things that were harmful, even things that were not healthy. Above all else, as you look at this whole issue, understand that maybe some of the things you're going through right now, there's a bigger thing at play here. Because as we go through the life of Joseph, honestly, one of the things you're going to ask yourself is, how come this guy, who was always trying to do the right thing, ends up in a worse situation? Because God's at work in his life, preparing him for something much, much bigger and better. And when you look back, you look at it and you go, wow, God really used this guy. But you need to understand, at 17, he's already paid a price. And it's been a tough life. So I end with this. Joseph's life reminds us that our family history does impact and influence our life. Everyone has to decide what family history needs to be embraced and what family cycles need to be broken. We're not the products of our environment, but we are influenced and impacted by our families. Joseph is a great example of someone who was raised in a dysfunctional family, yet he overcomes his environment. Don't blame your past for your present choices in life. Let's pray. Lord, help us. Use us. Grow us into the people that you want us to be. For those that are struggling, encourage their hearts that, Lord, you're still at work. For those that are struggling with this issue of being maybe too passive with their kids or giving them too much too soon, would you help them to be able to set boundaries? And Lord, for all of us, may we make choices this week that honor you, and Lord, that we don't get into this habit of just blaming our past or our family or our parent, but we take some ownership and we do some things differently, Lord. So use us, these things we ask in your name. Amen. Let's stand. We're